On November 4, 2010, early in the morning, at Changi Airport in Singapore, a Qantas Airways Airbus A380 with 440 passengers and 29 crew members took off. The aircraft was making a 2-hour stopover in Singapore to refuel after taking off from London. Sydney, Australia was the final destination. The estimated travel time to Sydney was 7.5 hours. However, the enormous aircraft and its close to 500 passengers will hardly survive this day's flight over Singapore. This flight was being conducted on an airplane that was only 2 years old. Actually, it was the first of 6 A380s that Qantas would receive. The largest passenger airplane ever constructed is the A380. With a high degree of redundancy in its onboard equipment, it was the most technologically advanced airliner in the sky at the time. Thousands of sensors located throughout the aircraft were linked to banks of computers, providing the pilots with real-time information about the state of the aircraft. 2010 saw the aircraft, while being brand new, start to establish itself as a very dependable and safe passenger carrier. However, one vital component of the plane's design would be seriously called into question by the events that were going to transpire on this day. This morning, there was a somewhat odd group of pilots in the flight deck. An A380 crew of 2 typically operates the aircraft, a first officer and a captain. However, in addition to the captain and first officer, there were 5 pilots in the cockpit on this particular day. In order to allow the other pilots to relax, a second officer was scheduled to assume control during the trip. Additionally, a check captain in training was there, and a supervising check captain oversaw him. A check captain's job is to regularly evaluate the flight crew members' performance to make sure they are meeting expectations. The captain was being evaluated today. Richard Decrepit, a 53-year-old man seated on the left-hand seat, was that captain. His flying expertise totaled over 15,000 hours, making him a very skilled pilot. He had begun his career as an 11-year member of the Australian Air Force in the middle of the 1980s. He quit the Air Force and founded a computer software business. He joined Qantas in the late 1980s when the airline business was not hiring, and he mostly flew A330s and 747s there. In 2008, he began training to fly the A380. Considering that the aircraft was relatively new, he was still getting used to it at this point. Matt Hicks, a first officer, was second in charge. Hicks was also quite experienced, having flown the A380 for more than twice as many hours as the captain, more than 1,200 hours total. He has logged more than 11,000 hours of flight time in a wide range of aircraft, such as the Airbus A330 and A340 and the Boeing 747-767. There is no guarantee that increased pilot count will increase safety. Despite the apparent benefit, the pilot itself had not accrued as much flying hours as the check captain in training and the supervising check captain. It is not unusual for uncertainty to arise under these circumstances over who is truly in command, particularly in an emergency. Having flown the A380 for over twice as many hours as the captain, more than 1,200 hours in total, Hicks was likewise highly experienced. Over 11,000 hours of flight time have been accrued by him in a variety of aircraft, including the Boeing 747-767 and the Airbus A330 and A340. Despite the seeming advantages, there is no certainty that a higher pilot count will result in greater safety compared to the trainee check captain and the supervising check captain. The pilot had fewer flight hours. It is not rare for questions about who is actually in charge to come up in these situations, especially in an emergency. The captain made it plain from the beginning of the flight that the chain of command would be the same as it would be on any other trip in which the captain would be in command, in order to reduce this danger. The other crew members in third place, the first officer, and the second in command. It would turn out that this of crew resource management was vital, considering what was going to happen this day. That morning at around 9:45, after being loaded with 106 tons of gasoline. After the enormous aircraft retreated from the Singaporean gate, the 440 passengers boarded and made themselves comfortable for the Sydney journey. The aircraft was aligned on runway 20 center at 9:56 a.m., and the captain ignited the 4 Rolls-Royce engines to initiate the takeoff. After takeoff, everything went according to plan for a brief period of time. The aircraft was climbing out of the Singapore Strait when the crew retracted the landing gear and the flaps. It reached a speed of 250 knots, or around 460 km/h during this period. But the jet was shaken by two thunderous booms when it approached 7,000 feet. The second engine. On the left side of the aircraft, the inboard engine had blown up. Metal fragments were sent through the engine case at a velocity greater than the sound. Then it blasted straight through the fuselage and left wing. Jet fuel shot out under the wing immediately, very next to the red-hot engine. For everyone on board, it would be disastrous if it caught fire. The autopilot's altitude hold button was immediately activated by the captain, halting the aircraft's ascent. The pilots knew little more than that something had occurred at this moment. The second engine. The extent of the engine's damage to the remainder of the aircraft was unknown to them at this time. What the crew didn't know was that when the searing hot shards of metal had erupted out from the engine, they entered the aircraft's fuselage in one of the worst locations conceivable. As they raced through the fuselage at supersonic speeds, they cut bundles of electrical cable that supplied power to various aircraft systems, such as the hydraulic power, fire protection, electrical power, and flight controls. It's estimated that 650 cables had been severed. The captain gave his co-workers confidence that he was in control of the aircraft and told the first officer to start going through the checklists, which were now visible on the central display in front of the pilots, known as the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitor, or ECAM. Although there was a calm and concentrated environment in the cockpit, the crew soon realized that this was not your typical engine failure. Warning messages for systems unrelated to the engines had begun to appear on the ECAM. Clearly, something had gone horribly wrong. The passengers seated on the left side of the aircraft, in contrast to the pilots, had a direct view of what had gone wrong. The engine shrapnel had punched holes in the wing, which they could see. Additionally, they saw gasoline pouring back from the airplane and leaking out from beneath the wing. The damage was starting to show itself back in the cockpit. The crew's initial round of cautions had to do with the engine itself. The ECAM showed many relevant warnings in addition to the ones indicating that the engine had stalled and that the engine-to-turbine was overheating. The engine turbine was, in fact, nearly completely destroyed. These alerts only alluded to the harm already done. After turning off the engine, the crew informed air traffic control of their situation. Fearing that there could have been an engine issue, one of the two fire extinguisher bottles in the engine was released by the pilots due to a fire. Worrisomely, though, they never got word that the bottle had been released. They tried the process again, but this time there was no response. After talking it over, the group agreed it would be prudent to try the second bottle. Once more, there was no indication that anything had happened when they shot it. They were unaware that the engine's fire suppression system was one of the systems that the explosion had severed. Has a hole in the wing next to the engine releasing gallons of jet fuel. An engine fire was the very last thing they needed. Now was a key moment for them. Meanwhile, not far south of Singapore, on the island of Butter, huge fragments of engine wreckage were falling from the sky. Some fragments caused damage to homes and automobiles, while another broke through the roof of a school. Some Batam locals started tweeting that a Qantas plane had crashed after spotting the airline's insignia on some of the debris. News broadcasters started playing images of the engine debris as the damaged aircraft flew in a loop. Fears that one of their planes had crashed back inside the aircraft caused the price of Quantum shares to begin to plummet. This was unknown to the pilots. They were overly preoccupied with addressing the very real risk that they would not return to Singapore. There were caution signs and alarm bells all throughout the cockpit. Using the push button in front of him, the first officer proceeded to cancel these warnings, painstakingly going through the things on the checklist. There has never been an emergency like this before. Never had an Airbus A380 encounter such a complicated and deadly collection of malfunctions. The airline was automatically receiving the warning alerts that the pilots were receiving at Qantas headquarters in Sydney, but no one there was able to get in touch with the team. Shrapnel from the engine had turned off the satellite communication equipment aboard the aircraft. It was the pilots alone. The first cop was working through the dozens of warning signs that had shown up on the screen in front of him. And even with all his experience, he was at his limit. He had to choose which cautions to take seriously and which to disregard with the assistance of his co-workers. It seemed concerning that engine number 2 was not the only one that had sustained damage. As a matter of fact, the 3 surviving engines were not running at all. First and fourth engines. The two outboard engines are now operating in what is referred to as a degraded condition, which indicates that certain engine the pilots had no access to parameters. While it seemed to be in better shape than the other two engines, engine number 3 was operating in what is known as an alternative mode. The pilots felt uneasy since they had no idea how the remaining engines were operating. It was possible that the explosion had caused them harm, but the computers were just failing to see it. The last thing the crew wanted to happen was to have further engine failures and not be able to return to Singapore. There were still several warning messages and many more for them to receive. Steps to take. The pilots now had to decide whether to make the difficult decision to return to Singapore right now or to take their time solving their issues over the sea. Both options carried a substantial risk. The 5 crew members needed to consider their alternatives thoroughly. They ran the danger of causing greater damage to the aircraft by running out of fuel, hydraulic fluid, or electrical systems if they attempted to inspect the damage while it was still in the air. Stated differently, the aircraft could now be controlled. How long would that last, though? Would it be unwise to squander valuable time up in the air when they could immediately bring it into land? However, if they chose to land at this time, it was impossible to predict the aircraft's behavior as it approached slower and slower. The pilots were still working their way through the over 100 communications that had flashed in the cockpit. They were still evaluating the damage, determining which systems they could use and which ones they couldn't, as well as whether the brakies and flaps were operating. When they desired it, would the landing gear extend? The pilots would need to provide answers to these important questions prior to their landing. Ultimately, the captain determined that returning right away carried more danger than continuing to troubleshoot longer. The plane had enough of fuel and was manageable, at least for the time being. He wanted to wait to go back to Singapore until he understood what he was getting into. The crew requested to be placed in a holding pattern and informed air traffic control that it would take them approximately 30 minutes to go through the ECOM messages and related procedures. In case further engines failed, the skipper was keen to be within gliding distance of Singapore. Thus, the crew informed the controller of this request. The A controller in Singapore gave them the all-clear to hold out a few miles from the airport, over the ocean to the east of Singapore. He then notified the flight crew that locals on the Indonesian island of Batam had discovered many aircraft parts. The pilots were shocked to learn this. Since the situation started, it was the first time their minds had been forced to leave the aircraft. Still, they had no need to worry about this just yet. The captain entered a holding pattern at 7400 ft out of the sea, and the crew started to work evaluating the aircraft's problems by drawing up an accurate image of the damage done to the airplane. They would provide themselves the greatest opportunity for a secure journey back to Singapore. The passengers were informed of this strategy and their desire to return to Singapore by the captain and check captain through a series of announcements. The passengers were comforted that they had been prepared to manage such crises after they had determined what was wrong with the plane. But in actuality, no one had been educated for this particular situation. The pilots were only starting to deal with the serious and intricate damage that the shrapnel that tore through the plane did to vital systems. Following an encounter with the next barrage of information the crew received concerned the aircraft's hydraulic systems, a sequence of alerts about the engines. The Airbus A380's landing gear and brakes are hydraulically operated, while the flight controls are powered by a mix of electrical motors and hydraulic actuators. The pilots were notified that the green system, one of the aircraft's 2 hydraulic systems, was completely emptying. This indicated to the pilots that, in the absence of a working green hydraulic system, they were dealing with much more significant issues. The controls for the flight would be slow, and the pilots would have to rely only on gravity to expand the landing gear as they approached the touchdown. Moreover, it powers the apparatus. The slats at the front of the wing are likewise powered by the green hydraulic system. In order to provide more lift as the aircraft approaches the landing, the slats are stretched, allowing the aircraft to fly slower in the absence of working slats. The pilots would need to land with less braking force and much faster than usual. With the engine out of commission and the hydraulic pressure dropping, it was starting to seem unlikely that the aircraft would be able to come to a halt on the runway. The pilots had to cope with a damaged aircraft that didn't seem to be able to stop once it hit the ground or stay in the air for very long to exacerbate the situation. The third engine, the lone remaining reliable engine, was the one supplying hydraulic power to the lone operational hydraulic system, the hydraulic system in yellow. The pilots would be in serious trouble if this didn't work. But even in a plane as sophisticated as the A380, the pilots can only learn so much from the equipment. They made the decision to examine the damage themselves in order to have a clearer understanding of what was actually going on. The two examined the damage. The second officer entered the passenger compartment after exiting the cockpit. A passenger who was also a Qantas pilot pointed out the screen in the seat back in front of him as he moved around the top deck of the cabin. Passengers can view a CCTV camera positioned on the tail of the A380 on their screens. He saw an image of the aircraft from the tail camera, with what appeared to be fuel flowing in large quantities from the left wing, on the screen in front of him. It was unclear at this stage if the fluid was jet fuel or hydraulic fluid. Next, the second officer descended to the lower deck of the airplane to examine the wing damage more closely. He could tell the trailer fluid was enormous as he approached. It originated from the underside of the wing, near the number 2 engine, and was roughly half a meter in thickness. In addition, he saw that it seemed as though the turbine section behind the second engine had been totally destroyed. To share his findings with the other pilots, he went back to the cockpit. Considering how much gasoline the second officer observed seeping from the wing, the pilots made the decision not to add fuel to the tank that was leaking. They were instructed to transfer by the gasoline, but the pilots' collective expertise on this trip enabled them to see that this would not be a safe course of action. They were given several identical warnings, and each time they had to decide whether to accept or refuse the ECAM based on their experience. With the 440 passengers' capacity to function under pressure on the line, this was the crew's final test, and all they could do was pray that they were making the right choices. Under normal conditions, considering the weight of their aircraft and the deteriorated braking and flying controls, the pilots would have preferred to dump gasoline at this moment. Execution. For the landing, they aimed to be as light as possible, but they couldn't dump gasoline since the explosion had damaged the fuel management system of the airplane. They would thus be 50 tons overweight when they land. Furthermore, the aircraft was starting to become unbalanced. The left wing was losing a lot of fuel, so much so that it was now nearly 10 tons lighter than the right wing, and the difference was growing every minute. This imbalance would worsen the longer the crew troubleshot from the air. After going through the hundreds of them for more than an hour, the crew had reached the end of their collection of fraudulent communications. They had developed a common mental image of the damage to their aircraft during this period. Landing their damaged jet was now the only task remaining. However, there was an issue. They were 50 tons overweight. This would be an issue even if everything else about the plane was how it should be. However, the plane was not in its usual state. The explosion had gravely compromised its capacity to shatter. To determine whether they could stop on the runway, the pilots needed a method. They employed the landing system element of the aircraft's onboard information system to do this. To determine their landing distance, use the performance application. They provided the computer with data, including the weight of the aircraft, the state of the Singaporean runway, and the identification of the flying controls and aircraft systems that were not working. The concept was to enable the computer to determine the aircraft's stopping distance precisely by providing precise information about its state. However, there was yet another issue. Upon entering these variables into the computer by the pilots, it couldn't figure out how far to land. It was just not built to handle the volume of faults the aircraft was having. However, the pilots were forced to improvise since they needed to estimate the landing distance. They played around with the computer, eliminating each failure one at a time, beginning with the least significant ones in this case. Crew resource management, which is the industry term for teamwork, was crucial. Based on their own experiences, each pilot contributed, and the crew as a whole attempted to identify a set of factors that they felt fairly represented the condition of the aircraft. They repeatedly performed the landing computation, removing a new issue each time, until at last the computer provided a response. The computer says that due to their weight and the malfunctioning leading edge slats, they would have to execute their approach 35 knots quicker than usual. Their landing distance would be further increased as a result. They may, however, pull over on the runway. Error margin was really narrow. In reality, the computer predicted that they would halt with only 130 meters remaining on the 4,000-meter runway. A runway overrun would occur if the captain did anything other than extremely accurate flying, which would not be good for the passengers. Furthermore, there remained a danger that they might go off the end of the runway, even if the crew performed flawlessly. The computer generated a landing distance estimate solely based on an imprecise representation of the aircraft damage. The captain summoned the lead flight attendant and instructed them to get the cabin ready for a runway overrun and subsequent evacuation because there was a very serious chance that the aircraft would go off the end of the runway. The pilots also reported to air traffic control that gasoline was leaking from the left wing and that they would require emergency assistance upon landing. Prior to rerouting the aircraft in the direction of the airport, if there were significant problems impacting it, the pilots wanted to make sure that it was under control. The manner in which the plane operated. Knowing this now would be preferable to learning the truth when things get really close. In order to evaluate the plane's controllability in each configuration, down to flap number 3, which they would use for landing, the captain gradually lowered the flaps. He discovered that the aircraft was quite slow yet manageable. The airplane was substantially slower to bank left and right when part of its wing spoilers were lost. For the crew to execute a steady approach, they would have to align with the runway far out. When they requested this from air traffic control, they were routed for a 20-mile final into runway 20, centered at Singapore. The pilots then lower the gear by using the gravity extension handle. The gear seems to have extended correctly after a tense moment. After that, the pilot performed some controllability checks on the aircraft to make sure it could still fly with its gear, and flaps extended. The plane was again sluggish but still controllable. But with engine number 2 down and engines 1 and 4 operating at a reduced capacity, it was far from clear that the plane's speed would be manageable as it touched down. Every approach calls for frequent adjustments to engine thrust, but the captain was hesitant should operate the engines 1 and 4 thrust levers, as it was unclear if they would react appropriately. His solution was to utilize engine 3 to regulate the plane's speed while maintaining the same thrust settings for engines 1 and 4. Since this looked to be the lone power plant that was unharmed, they were now positioned for landing and waiting for the passengers at the end of the runway. The pilots found this approach over the water to be quite nerve-wracking. That would be the crucial moment when the landing distance estimates are made, right? Would the plane be controllable on the ground? Could they possibly pause in time? The security of the pilot's ability to land the damaged aircraft at the proper position and bring it to a stop before the runway is fully extended is crucial for the 500 passengers on board. The plane landed quickly. The jet kept speeding down the runway until the captain floretted and shifted the sole operational engine, number 3, into reverse thrust. The captain was advised to apply the most manual brakies by the first officer. In response, the captain said he was braking as hard as possible. Using his own pedals that were connected to the captain's, the first officer verified that the pedals were, in fact, pressed to their stops. The runway ended quickly, getting close. The enormous plane started to slow down gradually. The crew was sure that it would stop in time when it reached roughly 60 knots. However, there was a fresh issue when it eventually came to rest, only 150 meters from the end of the runway. Actually, now more than at any other time throughout the trip, the crew and passengers were in danger. Fuel was still leaking from the left wing, and as it spread out on the ground, it began to approach the wheels and pull beneath the aircraft. The brake's temperature had risen to 900 degrees Celsius, as the pilots could see on their screens. Should the gasoline enter? A fire may start if there was contact with the white-hot brakes. In addition, the crew had received a radio alert from the fire department informing them that the main outboard engine, located on the left side, was still operational. Nothing managed to stop it despite the crew's best efforts, including pulling the lever to cut off the engine's gasoline supply. 3 tons of jet fuel were strewn across the runway, while the engine remained locked on high power. The captain had to make a crucial choice. Should he keep the passengers on board despite the possibility of a catastrophic fuel explosion, or should he tell them to leave right away? The flight crew determined that, at that particular moment, the passengers were safest inside the aircraft after weighing their options. A jet engine that was operating and thousands of kg of gasoline were outside the airplane. However, the cabin would have to be evacuated right away in the event of a fire. The cabin crew was alerted to an impending evacuation by the captain through a coded statement over the PA system. The firefighters started sprinkling fire retardant over the fuel beneath the airplane. And lastly, 13 minutes following the plane's landing, the flight crew determined that allowing the passengers to depart via the air stairs located on the right side of the aircraft would be the most secure course of action. They had to use their cell phones to call the firm to send their air stairs to the plane, though, as the explosion had destroyed all but one of their radios, which they were using to communicate with the fire department. After almost 20 more minutes, some buses and these staircases showed up to transport the 440 people to the station. The passengers were returned to the airport terminal once they had gradually disembarked. 3 hours after landing, the first engine continued to run, when firefighters used foam that retards fire to submerge it until they were able to put out the fire. Amazingly, not a single passenger or crew member sustained injuries during the whole experience. One of the best examples of mentoring in aviation history, according to retired Royal Air Force helicopter pilot and human factors specialist Carrie Edwards, was made possible by the flight crew's extraordinary collaboration and decision-making. The Order of Australia was given to the captain, Richard Terrebonne, in recognition of his extraordinary flying and emergency professionalism. However, what initially triggered this disastrous engine failure? How did a brand new airplane with an impeccable track record be so close to catastrophe? Investigators discovered that the cause was a tiny break that had grown over time in one of the engine's pipes. Oil had begun to seep through it and onto the engine turbine as it became larger. This oil caught fire on Flight 32 when it came into contact with the turbine's high temperatures. One of the turbine discs was damaged by heat from the ensuing fire, and because it was spinning normally, the damage prevented the disc from withstanding the rotational forces, and it exploded. An uncontained engine failure occurred when the turbine disc pieces broke out of the engine case due to the extreme speed of this explosion. Because the engine casing is especially designed to prevent this from happening, this is an uncommon occurrence. It was extremely lucky that none of the engine pieces entered the passenger compartment because this may have resulted in fatalities. The engine manufacturer, Rolls-Royce, had a manufacturing problem that was the main cause of this oil pipe malfunction. Consequently, all A380s equipped with the Trent 900 engine type had inspections performed on them. 53 of these engines were subsequently taken out of service. It is worth noting that this safety improvement has prevented any other incidents of this kind, involving Airbus A380s. The aircraft that was involved in this incident was repaired at a cost of $145 million USD and is still in service today. A few days after the event, the captain of this flight boarded a journey home to Sydney. However, the engine on that aircraft failed soon after takeoff as well, and the flight was forced to return to Singapore. After spending several more days trapped in Singapore, he eventually returned to Australia.